Hello and welcome to week 13 of this rainy season garden journal thing. It has been quite a wet week I'm not really sure I'm going to take a camcorder out into the garden type sense. And in addition to that, my camcorder decided it was going to give up the ghost halfway through and needed me to spend hours poking it until it would decide it was going to work again. And also I got older, so this is quite a short one this week. So for anyone who was hoping for another sort of 25-minute one, why first, but also that's not what you're getting this week. So yeah, with that covered, let's get on with it. So inevitably, this week involved scything. Don't all weeks, doesn't everyone's week. And I do want to touch quickly on how much you can see the grass changing, and I realise that for people who don't know the property, this is harder than for people who do, but you will be able to compare this field to one immediately across the line of dracaenas I planted at the beginning of the season, that has only been scythed once this season, in large parts not at all, so for large parts of it this will be its first scything, but this is the part that I've scythed. I think this is the fourth, maybe fifth time I have scythed this part, and you can see it is getting a lot smoother, to the point that I'm actually starting to think about using the sort of lawn blade as opposed to the bush blade, because the way that I cut with the bush blade, as much as it's becoming quite a stuck habit at this point, is kind of unnecessarily time consuming on this particular field, because the grass has become much softer and the types of grasses that are coming through have changed too. So we're getting a lot of the smaller, more sort of evergreen, I don't know if that's the right word, but although a lot of the grasses, tall and short in here, are perennial, some of the smaller ones are better at remaining green through a larger part of the dry season, particularly through winter, which just means that your chance of everything catching fire is less, which kind of leads us on to what I really wanted to talk about, which is why I seem to be perpetually battling to keep the grass down. And there are a whole myriad of reasons. The most straightforward one is grass burns really well. I would say there's three main factors in why after the collapse of the Pleistocene forests, grass took over, and it's humans, elephants and fire, and not necessarily in that order. Fire really helps grasses in the short term because it helps them damage other plants and also chases away a lot of their predators, although it does affect the soil in the long term. So at least in the rather weak African soils, it's not a great long-term strategy to have fires going through every year, but basically since the 50s, that is what we as a nation have been doing, is setting fire to everything. I had a friend who, if he was driving in the late dry season and he saw an area that wasn't on fire, he'd get out of his car and set it on fire because he thought he was doing a public service. Nowadays we have laws against that, but that was actually something that was encouraged during the colonial and early independent administrations, was burning, because it was seen as improving the soil and good for pasture. I don't agree that it is good in the long term for soil or pasture. It does expose some new growth, which is good in the short term for some grazers, but I would say having mixed species grazing would be more effective at that. I'm in the absence of some zebra or buffalo to take care of the tougher grasses though, and wanting the trees not to get eaten, scything cuts them down. The other part is the sort of light access for the plants that I do want in the longer term. So a lot of the fruit trees I have, as much as I don't want them in full sun, I don't want them to being sort of suffocated by the collapsing stems of very vigorous grasses while they're still too small to really compete with the grass. I do not scythe with the express intention of dismembering the dogs, and I will assure you, as the dogs start wandering closer and closer to the side of the day, that no dogs, or chickens for that matter, were harmed in the making of this video. This is actually the field that you can see I've only scythed parts of once before this season. It is much it is much tougher. You're seeing a lot more sort of stumps of the grasses being left behind because they've had time to thicken up. A lot of it's the same species, but without the smaller grasses starting to come through so quickly. But yeah, so hopefully with a couple more scythings this will be more similar to the first one, and both of them with as much grass as I can possibly cut down should be very carbon rich come next year's rains. In other sort of observations, you might notice there's a certain amount of a stiff-armed scything going on anytime I get close to trees, or for that matter dogs that want to sit down right in my path. And that actually, as much as the bush blade is what I would say is the better scythe blade for me, cutting in those areas, for smaller areas with denser areas of things I do not want to cut down, so essentially in sort of more heavily planted areas or more heavily wooded areas, scything isn't always entirely ideal. There's actually a few bits in here that I'm going to have to come and try and do something else, or just trample as I do a little bit of pruning, because they are so dense amongst young trees that I do not want to cut down, or in some cases perennial wildflowers that I do not want to cut down until they've at least flowered. Those parts will be easier, I'll just cut them down later in the year after they've seeded. But in other areas, especially with less open spaces and more things that I don't want to cut, shears can be useful. So I'm going to call this the Gloriosa garden, which is kind of back to front because Gloriosa, which is the flame lily, which is a really beautiful flower I should put up on the screen about now. As much as it is something I want here, it is one of the only things I want here that I didn't actually plant here. So this is a part of particularly poor soil over the property. It is getting better slowly, but a lot of the grasses you saw on the last clip wouldn't grow here just because it is a much weaker soil, and it's a lot harder to get a lot of things established here. I don't know exactly why it's quite so problematic. It used to be shaded by 2 large rubber trees, which might have affected the soil chemistry, and the other explanation is that it is very open to the prevailing wind since those rubber trees came down. There is a possibility someone used chemistry here that I wouldn't necessarily recommend for soil health before I was here, but it is slowly getting better, so I'm not too concerned. I have had 3 citrus trees, 2 limes and 1 orange, revert to rootstock here, and there's actually quite an interesting twist to that. They're all purchased ones which were grafted, and hence rootstock. While I would have expected 3 rough lemons, which is the usual base that I'm used to here, I've actually ended up with 2 rough lemons and 1 trifoliate orange, which is not a citrus I had ever really heard of, and it's something probably everyone around me will regret, because I make far too much marmalade when our grapefruit start overproducing, and trifoliate oranges, as far as I've read, are not good for much except rootstock and marmalade. So yeah, there will be marmalade, and so to everyone in my vicinity I offer my heartfelt condolences, I guess, on that. Elsewhere, I'm having a more or less opposite problem. This small tree you can see right in the center, right over my shoulder here, is an Artocarpus, but I'm not entirely sure which one. I never actually saw the fruit the seed came from. I think it's probably Cempedak, which I'm probably saying wrong, which is a Malaysian and Indonesian smaller relative of jackfruit. But it is actually, for once, something is getting shaded out, because my thicket has developed to a point where there is such a thing as too much shade. So I'm cutting back some bamboo palms and some of the native fruiting trees that have popped in above it, that are shading it just a little bit more than I want. In much deeper shade than this, the true jackfruit does well, so I don't think it's the same. A more typical victim of too much shade is this aloe, possibly the same species as the other garden aloe, which I think is Aloe, but it does seem to be a little bit more shade needing, but this one was in just a bit too much and became rather etiolated, and then got knocked down in a storm, and lying across the drive isn't a great place to grow, so to keep the pollinators well fed, I've transferred it into a slightly less shady, still quite shady, but less shady spot, and shoved it into the ground between some tree roots. We'll hope that it doesn't break, but if it does, in all fairness, it's just going to mean I get 2 aloes, because these shoot very well from just a piece of stem, so this could easily make 4 if I cut it up enough. Very popular, as with most aloes, with the sunbirds, so who needs hummingbirds, really? I bought some plants, yet again. I'm going to say that I'm very tired of everything you can buy coming in plastic bags. With some plants, which I know well, it's easy enough to get the bag off reasonably intact. But when something is unknown to me, or has a potentially fragile root system, I tend to have to tear the bag to get it out without risking it, which is frustrating, because then I just have more waste. This is actually a Goji Berry, I should probably say that, which is very unknown to me. I've seen them written down on packages that are too expensive for me to buy, so we will see how it goes. It's more temperate than here, but hopefully this is a well-drained spot that should be good for it. And next up, I got a little distracted making space, and a little further afield than necessary perhaps, I trimmed back this pitanga, and also cut back the stems of a few small saplings that I don't want to turn into trees, but I'm happy for them to keep feeding me mulch. And then there's a small African olive, which you can just make out in front of me, which just need a little bit of a trim to try and chase it up a bit. Should be very climate appropriate. We should eventually get quite small but edible olives from it. I'm also pulling out a couple of these fishbone ferns, which are Australian. They should be vulnerable to some native herbivores because they're the same genus as several native ferns, just a little bit more aggressive and easier to come by. To make space for this little Mexican lime. Lovely little tree. I do have one comment. It was potted in clay. This is one of the hardier limes, so that probably isn't an issue, but generally speaking, citrus is probably the last thing I would pot in clay. Free draining is the first thing you should think of with citrus, and the second thing should be acid, not clay. Finally, I also made a fairly fatal mistake of my own, in that I bought 2 kiwi fruit seedlings. Now, one of the things with kiwi fruit that I had known and had completely forgotten is that they are usually male and female on separate plants. So while 2 of them could be enough, the odds of it being so are 50%. It's coin flip. So rather than wait, I think 3 years and find out if I've been sensible, I will be needing to get some more of these. I will put which nursery I got them from in the description for anyone in Zambia who's interested, but that should be everything for this week. So before I go too far off on a ramble, I think I will say sorry this one's been a bit of a rush job. I just felt, wanted to get something out to prove to myself that I could more than anything else. And also I think any sort of fans of the dogs will enjoy one of the clips coming up, but anyone who's not a fan of a jumping spider should leave after the dog exits the frame, okay? Yeah, so I will see you next Tuesday. Goodbye.